You can save every day by shopping at Whole Foods Market. Seriously, don't just go for the big sales. Walk the store and see the savings for yourself. In the seafood department, look for the yellow low price sign on Whole Foods Market Responsibly Farmed salmon. This fish is perfect for the grill. Buttery, fatty, yet lean, nice thick fillets. I'm getting hungry just thinking about it, and I know I can get it at a great price. There's so many ways to save at Whole Foods Market. Now you know.
Texting between two different kinds of phones makes photos blurry, ugly, and security risky. Not just that, it also makes video calling, editing messages, or leaving a group nearly impossible. With WhatsApp, everyone can enjoy seamless messaging with the protection of end-to-end encryption. Streamline your messages across all devices on WhatsApp. Message privately with anyone you want. Click the banner or download now to learn more.
Imagine you're about to die. Let's say you were hit by a car, you're bleeding out, you're on the way to the hospital, but you just have this sense that you're not going to live. And you see visions of, let's say, someone you knew in the past, let's say a mother or a father, and they're saying, don't worry, we're here for you, come down this light at the end of a tunnel. Does that change your experience of life if you then survive? Well, we're going to hear from Sebastian Junger, who wrote In My Time of Dying, How I Came Face to Face with the Idea of an Afterlife. And if you don't know who Sebastian is, he's written tons of books about being a war reporter and his experience in war zones and other experiences like that. And his books are always very intense, but this is perhaps his most intense book that I've read, where he's not talking about deaths in the battlefield or in a war zone, but his own experience of dying and what happened to him during that experience. And it really makes you think. I've been thinking about it a lot for personal reasons this past week, and it really was interesting to me. So I hope everybody enjoys it. If you do, please retweet it. Please share it with your friends. Please subscribe to the podcast so all the good little algorithms work for me. So thanks so much, and here is Sebastian.
This isn't your average business podcast, and he's not your average host. This is the James Altucher Show.
What compelled you to write it? I mean, it's very different from. I don't want to say it's very different from your other books. I think stylistically it's similar, but it's different in the terms of that you're veering into a lot of speculation instead of kind of I'll let you describe.
Yeah, I mean, what compelled me to write to the book is that I'm an author and I almost died, and I saw very strange things on the threshold of death that were at odds with my understanding of physics and my commitment to atheism and rationality. And I wanted to understand them, and I understand things by researching them and writing about them. And then the magic of that process is that if I can understand something, and, I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer, right? And if I can understand something, I can usually get my readers to understand it as well. And then that's the magic of journalism.
So can you describe, just jumping into the middle of the book, describe specifically what you saw? You're on the edge of death after this abdominal bleeding starts. Yeah. And the doctors are wheeling you into surgery and treatment. And with half your, I guess, vision or inner vision, you saw this darkness, and the other half is like you see life. And what happens from there?
I don't know if I saw life, but I saw something puzzling. So I had a abdominal hemorrhage. I was losing a pint of blood into my own abdomen every 10 or 15 minutes. There's 10 pints in the human body, so you have an hour or so. And I was an hour drive from the hospital. So you can do the math. And when I got there, I was actively dying. I had maybe 10 or 15 minutes of life left. And they decided to put a large gauge needle through my neck into my jugular to transfuse me with as much blood as possible My blood pressure was 60 over 40. So they didn't have any time to spare. And while they were working on my neck, this black void appeared below me. And, again, I'll reiterate, I'm an atheist. I'm a rationalist. My father was a physicist and an atheist and a rationalist. And so just for proper context for what happened, this black void appeared above me. And I felt myself getting sort of pulled into it. Now, I had no idea I was dying. Absolutely no idea. And thank God, or I would have been very scared. And very, very sorry.
Can I ask, and I don't mean to interrupt, but you were being wheeled into surgery. You were in massive pain. Everybody was transfusing everything into you. Is it a trick of the mind that you didn't think you were dying? Like, does the mind kind of not want you to think you're dying, so it plays tricks at that point? Or did you really, you must have had some guess that this was trouble.
Well, I guessed it was trouble, but I didn't know I was dying in that moment. I thought maybe I have cancer in my abdomen and a tumor that ruptured, and I'm going to wake up to very bad news tomorrow that they took out what they could, but I got 3 months. I knew that something was happening that was probably going to be very scary, but I didn't know I was dying in the next 10 minutes, right? I'm not a doctor. If I'd been a doctor, I would have read the signs like, oh, bro, you got an abdominal hemorrhage. You got minutes left. But I'm not a doctor. I had no idea. I had completely bearable pain in my abdomen. That's it, right? So when the doctor asked permission to put a needle in my jugular, which is a somewhat risky procedure, my answer to him was like, "Why are you doing that? In case there's an emergency?" And he said, "This is the emergency." So I really didn't know, and so this void opened up underneath me, and I started to get pulled into it, and I was terrified, and I didn't want to go into the void because I sort of knew, if I go in, I'm not coming out.
Can I ask, when you say the void opened up underneath you, like you were lying on a gurney or something, right? So
yeah.
What does it mean it opened up underneath you?
I just felt it underneath me and to my left, like this infinite blackness. And I was suddenly aware of this place, this dark place that I didn't want to go. And, of course, none of the doctors knew it was there, right? It was entirely my own perception, but boom, there it was. I was getting pulled into it. And then my dead father appeared above me, and I was completely shocked to see him. It's my dead father. Like, what are you doing here? Like, it made no sense to my rational mind. And he was there in this sort of intense energy form, right? And he communicated to me, "It's okay. You don't have to fight it. You can come with me. I'll take care of you." And the communication wasn't quite with words. It's very, this is very hard to describe with language. It's such a limited medium. And we're talking about things that are either totally hallucinatory or enormously profound and mysterious. Either way, language isn't really up to the job. But he communicated to me, "I'll take care of you. You can come with me." And I was absolutely horrified, right? I was like, "You're dead. I'm alive. I'm not going anywhere with you. We got nothing to talk about." In fact, I was almost sort of offended by the suggestion that I would want to go with him. I have 2 young daughters and wife, a wonderful family. Like, all right, I'm 58, but I'm in great health, and I'm not going anywhere with you, right? And I said to the doctor, "You got to hurry. You're losing me right now. I'm going." And then my memory is intermittent for the next 6 hours while they tried to save my life.
When you were when he was talking to you, do you feel like it was it wasn't like a dream experience? You felt like he was right there talking to you, or in some way more real than a dream?
Oh, it wasn't a dream at all. I was away. I was talking to the doctors. He was above me as much as the doctors were in the room. He was in the room with me, above me. But again, in a form that was a little bit different from the doctors, who were there, clearly physically there in front of me. If I reached out, I could touch them. My father, he was above me, and it was his energy. It's hard to describe. He was like his essence in this sort of energy form. And I wish English had better language for what I experienced.
You've done this exploration of all the different things that this might mean, particularly after, when you got out of the hospital, but just put us at ease. Like, you were okay. Obviously, it was this bleeding in your pancreas. What happened that, what did the doctors do?
Yeah, so it turned out I had an aneurysm in my pancreatic artery, which is there's 5 arteries that go to who knew, right? There's 5 arteries that go to the pancreas. And one of them quite small. It was probably the size of a number 2 pencil or something like that. Like it's, quite a small artery. It developed an aneurysm, a ballooning at a weak spot, right? And this isn't the product of bad health or a lifetime of sin or whatever, right? It really is like a random structural thing. And it's very rare in the spot that I had it. And so it sort of ballooned and the walls of the artery got thinner and thinner over the course of probably decades, right? Decades. And then in one moment, in mid-sentence, while I'm talking to my wife, it ruptured. And I started bleeding out into my own abdomen. And in that, all it took in mid-sentence was boom, suddenly I'm dying. And it's not like I'm a walking heart attack. I'm in very good health. There was nothing going on with me where I would think, oh, you know what, you're at some risk of dropping dead. Like that's not me, right? But little did I know that I had this abnormality in my abdomen. So what they did was they brought me into the interventional radiology suite. The last ditch attempt to save a person's life who has a hemorrhage like this is to cut their abdomen open and start looking for the bleed before the person bleeds out. It really is sort of battlefield surgery, right? But what they're able to do in interventional radiology is they put you on a fluoroscope where they can do sort of real-time X-ray video, basically. And of course, you get a fair amount of radiation, and I had radiation burns after that, but that's what was required to save my life. And then they thread a catheter from your groin into your femoral artery. A catheter is a flexible rubber or rubber tube or wire, and they thread it up your femoral from your groin and then up into your chest and through all the twists and turns of the abdominal arteries, and they can get the catheter really anywhere in your body, right? They can take sharp turns, they can double back, they can do whatever they need to do. And so that way they're able to put in stents or what have you without cutting the person open. So it's a huge, huge breakthrough in medical technology. And so they did that and they couldn't get to the spot that was bleeding. They could not get there by catheter. And at one point I watched the doctors sort of give up. They were like, well, we tried everything. It's probably off to surgery with him. And what I didn't know was that surgery I might have survived, but the chances were quite small that I would survive. I didn't know that. It's really a last-ditch thing. And then one of the doctors said, let's try going through his left wrist.
I didn't understand that actually. Like, why do they need to go in through, like, why can't they just cut your stomach open? Or is that the surgery?
That's surgery. If they cut your stomach open, there's all this blood in your abdomen and you bleed out very, very quickly. And, it's deep, deep abdominal surgery, and you're in already a very compromised state. So they got to move all the organs away. They have to get the liver out of there. They get the pancreas out of there. They're excavating into your abdomen when you're already very compromised, hoping to get to the bleed before all the blood runs out of you, right? Because
like left wrist, like what do they go all the way, they put something in and they go all the way to your arm and then down?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So what the left wrist allows is for them to come to that area in your abdomen from above, right? Which avoids all the entanglements that you have to deal with if you come from below through the groin. And it was those twists and turns of my vasculature that were impeding the progress of the catheter tube that they were trying to get into me. So from the left wrist, it was easier, and they just had to get past a blockage in my celiac artery that they forced open with a balloon, and that finally allowed them. But it was a very, very high level interventional radiology. Like very few IR specialists would have even thought of it, much less been able to pull it off.
So it's very creative of this doctor. I mean, you were lucky that particular doctor was there in the middle of Cape Cod on this day.
Oh, incredibly lucky. Like another specialist. The guy who trained the guy who saved my life, I happened to meet him a couple of weeks ago, and he said that maybe at most 5% of interventional radiologists would have even thought of doing that and been able to pull it off. Like he's like, you're really, really lucky. So my odds of living were terrifyingly small, but of course I didn't know that.
Right, like your odds include, when you had pain, calling the doctor. Not everybody does that. You did it right on time because you got, then you got to the hospital before all your blood leaked out. Then they saw you right away, which isn't always a guarantee in a hospital. And then they figured out what was causing the bleeding and figured out this method of intervention.
Yeah, I mean, when I arrived at the hospital in acute danger, and they don't make people wait around who are bleeding out. They knew exactly what was happening to me. They kicked a stroke off the fluoroscope to put me on it because they knew it was a matter of minutes before I died. So that that wasn't sort of random. And we called the ambulance because after I started bleeding, I stood up to sort of ease the pain, and I almost fell over. And and then I was in and out of consciousness, and eventually I started going blind. And all of that are symptoms of extreme blood loss. And so, there was no question that that we would call the ambulance. The problem is we lived in a very remote area that had no cell phone service. It's the end of a dead-end dirt road deep in the woods, and there's no cell phone service, and the landlines don't work when it rains, and it had been raining. So we were really, really very isolated. And if there was a miracle going on, one of them was that we got 1 bar of cell phone service from the driveway, which never happens, and we managed to call the ambulance with that 1 bar.
If your wife had driven you, what would have happened?
Well, she, it's a 1-hour drive to the hospital, and she would have been stuck in traffic, and I would have died next to her in the passenger seat.
And so, so they go in through the left wrist.
They go in through the left wrist, and I'm conscious the whole time because my vitals are too low to be given any morphine or anything. So, I'm in incredible pain, and I'm experiencing the whole thing, and hallucinating and all kinds of other unpleasant stuff. And eventually, like 2 a.m, they managed to get the catheter to the bleed, and they plugged the artery with a coil and plugged the drain basically, and saved my life. And they sent me back. Then I think they knocked me out and sent me up. I was able to see my wife very briefly and hold her hand for a moment. And they sent me up to the ICU, knocked me out. And I woke up the next morning in the ICU, and the nurse said to me, "Congratulations, you survived. Like, no one thought you were going to make it. You almost died last night." And I was completely shocked. And the next thing that happened was, after she told me that, I remembered, oh my God, I saw my father, and I saw the pit. And it all came back to me. And as soon as my wife got to the ICU that morning, that was what I said to her. I was like, I almost died, and I saw my father. He was right there. I don't know what to make of this.
And what did she make of it? What was her first reaction?
Her first reaction was, because I interviewed her later, and I interviewed all the doctors that agreed to talk to me. I tried to do my, because it was a subjective first-person account, which I didn't entirely trust because I wasn't of right mind. I tried to do as much reporting as possible, including interviewing my wife, and she confirmed that it was pretty much the first thing that I said when she walked in was, "I saw my dad," which gives me a level of trust that I didn't sort of somehow retroactively make it up or something, and what she made of it was, wow. If you saw your father, then you really did almost die. Like, she didn't know. She's not a doctor, right? And the doctors don't want to scare people, so they're careful saying to the wife, "Wow, your husband almost bought the farm last night." That's not the kind of thing that doctors say to spouses, right? And so in her mind, they were like, he had a problem. We fixed the problem. He's fine. Like, that's the sort of level that the doctors are on. But she was like, wow, you did. If you saw your father, that means you came really, really close. And that's when it sort of settled into her, like, wow, I almost lost him.
And what was her reaction to, like, when you said you saw your father, what did she think that was? Did she think that was that you really saw your father, or that maybe it was a hallucination? Like, what was her interpretation at first stab, so to speak?
She doesn't believe or disbelieve anything like that. So to her, either whether it's hallucination or something that's real by some physical objective standard, either way, you only hallucinate something like your dead father when you are right on the precipice of dying, right? I mean, the dying brain produces visions, right? We know that. And so like, if that's what's happening, you're really, really close. Or you could say that on some level we don't understand, possibly some quantum level, some subatomic level, there is some kind of post-death existence, and that the dead engage with the living in a way like when people read each other's minds, in a way, we sort of know it happens. We have no idea how or why. Like that there's some level to this that the physicists don't understand, but that in fact, like there's something real going on when the dying see the dead, which is extremely common and really lacks a complete explanation.
Take a quick break. If you like this episode, I'd really, really appreciate it. It would mean so much to me. Please share it with your friends and subscribe to the podcast. Email me at altucher@gmail.com and tell me why you subscribed. Thanks. Oh my gosh, this is my favorite sponsor because, as some of you might know, I lived for about 3 years in just Airbnbs. I didn't want to own. I didn't even want to rent. So I just started staying in Airbnbs. And yet I didn't have to deal with any kind of maintenance. I didn't have to deal with anything really. I had like plates, towels, furniture, TVs, cable TV. I didn't have to deal with any of all the stuff that people have to deal with when they start renting. So I loved staying in Airbnbs. I did it for about 3 years, or almost about 3 years. Whenever I stay in an Airbnb, I think this is such a great idea for people who own a home. Whenever they travel, you can make money while you're not using your place. Your home might be worth more than you think. Find out how much at airbnb.com/host. There is just so much more personal information on the internet about me, you, all of us than we could possibly realize. And it's not just like the dark web where maybe your email address, you're on some massive email marketing list. So I am so glad I found a site like Delete Me that actually removes your name and information from hundreds, maybe even thousands of websites. You got to check it out. You go to deleteme.com. But first, Delete Me finds and removes any personal information you know online and make sure that it stays off once you sign up for them. Delete Me is a subscription service, removes your personal info from the largest people search databases on the web, and in the process helps prevent or identify potential ID theft, doxing, phishing scams. So sign up and provide Delete Me with exactly what information you want deleted, and their experts take it from there. Trust me, you will find tons of stuff. Data brokers hate Delete Me. When you sign up, Delete Me immediately goes to work scrubbing all your personal information from data broker platforms. Your personal profile is no longer theirs to sell. So take control of your data and keep your private life private by signing up for Delete Me. Now at a special discount for listeners of the James Altucher Show, today get 20% off your Delete Me plan by texting James to 64000. Text James to 64000. The only way to get 20% off is to text James to 64000. I'll say it one more time. That's James. Text it to 64000. Message and data rates may apply. See terms for details. Let's start with like the most scientific potential applications. And you discuss all these in the book. So for instance, maybe at the moment of dying, you mention endogenous DMT or endogenous ketamine. So basically chemicals inside the body that are very similar to the drugs ketamine and DMT could potentially activate to protect the cells in your brain. So that's one theory of why these hallucinations or near-death experiences occur.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so there's two camps, right? There's a lot of very smart, well-credentialed people who have taken the thousands of accounts of NDEs and, that are across society. They're quite similar across societies through the ages and said this amounts to, and, these are MDs, right? These are doctors. These cases amount to not proof of, but evidence of some sort of afterlife, right? That there's that opinion is out there among some very, very serious, rigorous people, right? And then equally serious, well-credentialed, rigorous people, doctors, researchers, neurobiologists, et cetera, are like, nonsense. We can explain all of this through brain chemistry. And we know that the dying brain produces a surfeit of these sort of like hallucinatory endogenous chemicals that will give you visions. We know that epileptics, when they have seizures, will have visions, see a tunnel of light. When you put someone in a human centrifuge, when you put a fighter pilot in a human centrifuge and spin them around, and they experience low blood oxygen, low perfusion in the brain, that they will have all these crazy experiences and the white light and blah, blah. We can reproduce all of this in the lab. So these experiences, the NDE experiences, they don't prove there's an afterlife. We understand how all this works. And, not surprisingly, there isn't these are all rational and plausible arguments, and there isn't a sort of final proof. The one thing I'll say, and as I was going through it, I was so freaked out after I came back from the hospital, so unnerved, unsettled by what had happened to me. And this is pretty common, like incredibly anxious, right? Like really, really fearful. I was suddenly a very fearful person. So when I was reading these accounts of NDEs, I started with all the accounts by researchers who were sort of, quote, believers, right? That they were like, this overtly or not overtly, they were sort of suggesting this amounts to evidence of an afterlife. And as I was reading through this stuff, now I'm an atheist, I'm a rationalist, et cetera, right? But I'm reading through it and I'm in such a delicate place. I allowed myself this weird little hope that started to creep in, like, wow, maybe that's pretty convincing. Maybe there is an afterlife. Like, maybe there's nothing to worry about. Like, I couldn't help myself, right? And embarrassingly, right? And then I read the rationalists, like people, scientists like my father, saying, well, hold on a second. Like, let's be realistic here. Let's be real here. We can explain all of this through neurochemistry. And they're such like killjoys, right? They're like party ruiners. Like, oh, they looked like there was a chance for a while, but oh well. Like the rationalists take, rationalists take the debate as they always do, and sort of crushed my puny little hopes about like maybe there's something more. And except for one thing, right? So I was enormously convinced by the rational explanations, with one exception. And I'm not saying that this proves there's any post-death existence or disproves. I'm making no assessment in that regard. I will just say it opened a legitimate question in my mind. We know that if you give a room full of people LSD, they will all hallucinate. It's no mystery, right? We know that all of them will. We know why. We know how it works in the brain. There's no controversy. There's no confusion. It's settled science, right? But they will not all hallucinate the same things, right? And what is very odd about the experience of dying, whether it's in an acute situation like I was, with acute blood loss leading to a very rapid death or a heart attack, or the long, slow process of someone dying of old age in hospice, in a home, in their own home, or in a memory care unit or what have you, that over and over and over again, one of the most common experiences for these people, either the ones that come back from almost dying or the people who actually go on to die, but they're conversant with those around them in those final hours or days, is that they see the dead, that the dead seem to show up to escort them across or tell them, no, it's not your time. And it's a legitimately weird thing. And that there's neurochemical explanations for hallucinations in general, but no one has identified a protein or a compound in the human brain that necessitates a specific hallucination of dead relatives, right? Like that has not been isolated in the lab.
Well, there's that, and there's one other thing, but just addressing that for a second, you do mention how, and I separately looked this up, and it's definitely true that as someone's dying, these like gamma waves or whatever go through the brain, which trigger extreme memory retrieval. So obviously you're remembering something of your dad, and other people are remembering people in their lives. It's that whole sensation of, oh, my life flashed before my eyes. So could it be related to that, for instance?
Well, yeah, the memory retrieval, I mean, that connects more to this, what's called a life review, where the experience is that you're seeing in one moment simultaneously all of the events of your life, right? And it's called a life review, and it's a profound, overwhelming experience. I didn't have that. I interviewed someone who did. I didn't have that. What's strange about, I mean, I have, obviously, as we all do, I have 60 years of memories, right? Very few of them are of dead people, right? I mean, my memories include my family, people that are far more important to me than my dead father, right? My memory the only one or two people who died are actually important to me. Three people are actually personally important to me in that sense. And so these aren't memories. I didn't have a memory of my father, right? I wasn't like suddenly I was 8 years old and we were camping, right? What I saw was my father floating above me in a form that I didn't understand, communicating, right now, you can come with me. That's not a memory I have, right?
Right.
And you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So they're slightly different. And then the other aspect of it is that people in hospice, I mean, you ask hospice nurses about the process of dying, and they'll say that very, very often in the final hours or sometimes day or so, the dying person will be actively conversing with a dead relative, a dead loved one who seems to be in the room, right? And so that's not the gamma waves triggered by the final moments of brain death. This is the brain of a person who is still very much alive, though on the way out, and it's a rather odd thing. And one of the very odd things about it, and I know I'm sounding all woo-woo and mystical, and I don't mean to,
No.
but it is a legitimate question that I have. That might have a totally scientific answer, but we don't know what it is. But so one of the odd things that's been documented is that when the dying person sort of shows up in the hallucinations, that when the dead person shows up in the room of a dying person and their hallucinations, whatever you take that to be, sometimes the dead person isn't known to have died by the dying person because it happened very recently. And it's really that's really quite mysterious. And there are many accounts of that. And again, it begs an explanation.
Well, and there's two other things that actually were confounding. One is when your father died, or when he had, was hit by an attack or whatever, it was 3:15 in the morning, and you woke up experiencing your dad's pain essentially, and he was experiencing this hundreds of miles away, and you didn't know that at that point. Like, that actually sort of, it defies explanation. This other experience you had when he died.
Yeah, I mean, well, I'll explain it a little bit more precisely because it really was a puzzle to me. Again, a puzzle. It puzzled my rational mind, right? It challenged what I thought might be true about the world. So he was in Boston. He was in hospice care, and we knew that he had some, months left, right? It was not imminent. His death was not imminent, but it was inevitable. And I was living in New York, and 250 miles away or whatever it is, and suddenly in the middle of the night, I was woken up by him screaming my name from the next room, like, Sebastian, Sebastian, Sebastian. And I sat bolt upright. I mean, I was like, oh my God, what's going on? And I realized it was just a dream. And I looked at the clock and it was 3:15. A few hours later, I thought, how weird. A few hours later, my mother called and said, get to Boston as fast as you can. The nurse told me that last night, your father woke up in a panic, thrashing around and screaming. And often that's a sign that the person is in their last hours or maybe day, right? It's a sign of the next thing that happens is that they die. And it's a very, very common sign. And I said, wow, ask her what time that was. And of course, the nurses that have to write everything down. And it was 3:15, right? So we know at the sort of quantum level that entangled particles can communicate instantaneously, faster than the speed of light, across the entire universe. Whether we know that quantum entanglement allows for that. So it does make one wonder, like, can the human mind, by some mechanism that we don't understand yet, can the human mind communicate with other minds instantaneously across distance? I have to say that it's possible, not because there's a God or something, but because the physicists have not figured everything out yet.
And how did you explain it at the time? Because this even seems like a more remarkable occurrence than not to put down your seeing your dad as dying, but there are people have attempted to make scientific explanations of that, but I can't think of any real scientific explanation of what you just described. So, like, how did you describe it at the time?
I couldn't. Right? I mean, it had happened. Was it coincidence? Possibly. But I don't have an explanation, as I say in the book. The problem with rational thought, which of course is a very, very powerful mode of thinking, right? Like, airplanes fly because of rational thought. Like, medicine works, computers work. We're on a Zoom because very rational people figured some stuff out, right? Like, but the problem with rationality is that things keep happening in life that we can't explain, right? Like, and we all know that experience. So I don't know. I don't have an answer. If I did, I would have another book to write, but I don't have an answer for that question.
The other thing you talk about is people with near-death experiences that actually experience things happening, let's say, in the other room, or they picture themselves above their bodies while they're being operated on, which that I could almost see being there's some scientific explanation. But you mentioned a couple of near-death experiences where the person experienced something they couldn't possibly have been aware of that was happening, let's say, behind closed doors in another room.
Yeah, and again, you have to take these accounts as credible. If people are waking up and deciding to have some fun with the doctors and, whatever. I mean, if you want to be like infinitely skeptical, you can say, look, these are unreliable reports from people that might have gotten information later and then filled in and come up with a story either that they convinced themselves of or they wanted to convince other people of. Who knows, right? But the other explanation, if it is an explanation, but the other way of thinking is that some of the scientists who developed quantum theory, like Schrödinger and Heisenberg, Schrödinger, for example, his belief, he wasn't religious. His belief was that there was a universal consciousness that was part of the colossus of the universe, right? And consciousness was part of the physical nature of the universe in the same way that gravity is. Right? As gravity is this force, we all understand it. You jump out a window, you're going to fall to the ground. No one can really explain it. Like, okay, I got it, I'll fall, but why? Like, what is this force, this invisible force that affects all things? Likewise, Schrödinger was of the position that there was a universal consciousness and that when we die, we return to it, which raises the possibility that if there's a universal consciousness, maybe the individual consciousness between human beings can be violated at times in very indirect ways, and you can, quote, read someone's mind, right, across a distance. You can dream. Your father can wake you up in his sort of paroxysms of fear and anguish before he dies, all the way in New York City. And like with quantum entanglement, we just don't understand the physical process, but we're starting to get the sense that there's something real there that we need to explain.
Yeah, like the idea of quantum mechanics is that these tiny particles, and I'm no expert, obviously, none of us are, but these tiny particles, tinier than atoms, are affected simply by observation. When you observe something, when you measure one of these quarks or whatever, they change because you're measuring them.
That's right.
You're not measuring them. They actually become measurable because you're measuring them. And so then it gets back to, well, how before there was consciousness, let's say before there were any living beings, how did the universe even exist? Did the universe only really start to exist when there was consciousness to observe it?
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, obviously I'm not an expert either, and I would say there are many physicists who would say that they're not experts either because it's a profound mystery that that nobody understands. But the subatomic particles, not only does observation change their behavior, the subatomic particle is all things. It's in all positions. It has all values until it's observed, and then it has to pick one, right? So it's not just there's one thing or another. It's all things, and then it's one thing, right? And that's what's extraordinary about it. And it's called a quantum waveform, and the waveform is is the range of all mathematical possibilities for that subatomic particle. And then once you observe it, all of a sudden, of course, it can't be all all things can pass through two slits. Like there's the famous double slit experiment. There's two slits in a steel plate. You fire a photon at them. If there's two doorways, you can't walk through both at the same time, right? You have one body and you have to go through one or the other. Well, in the subatomic world, if you don't observe the photon, it will go through both slits simultaneously and leave a strike signature on a strike plate on the other side that's consistent with going through both slits, right? If you observe it, it's almost like it gets shy, right? It's like, oh, okay, well, I better abide by the sort of like norms that you humans are used to, and I'll just go through one slit since you're actually watching, right? And that's the sort of central mystery of quantum physics, that we know that it exists because of these tests, these experiments, but they make no sense to us in our macroscopic human brains.
Yeah, but the one thing I'll say though is that quantum mechanics, of course, applies to these very small particles. No one's really said whether it applies to large aggregations of particles like objects or human beings or whatever. So like if a tree falls in the woods, whether we observe it or not, a tree probably is actually falling in the woods. But you brought up this one guy, Robert Lanza, who wrote about biocentrism, this idea that consciousness actually created the universe. Can you describe his philosophy a little? Because I've read his stuff before.
Yeah, he's a really fascinating guy, and he's not the only person to talk about this. There's another guy whose name I just blanked on. But at any rate, Lanza is very readable and really brilliant and interesting, even if you wind up disagreeing with him. So it's called biocentrism. And the idea is that just as at the quantum level, if you observe a particle, it's forced to go from all possibilities to one. Likewise, the entire universe might be one massive range of possibilities, of all possibilities, right? An virtually infinite range of possibilities, until conscious life observes it. And then it collapses into one form, which is the universe that we know. And that consciousness, as Schrödinger said, is universal and part of the very physical nature of atoms and subatomic particles, the way gravity is, and with the Higgs boson. And that we don't understand how, but that sort of X factor in the universe of consciousness is what creates the universe in the form that we know it to exist, because we're in it, because we're creating it by observing it.
Oh my gosh, this is my favorite sponsor because, as some of you might know, I lived for about 3 years in just Airbnbs. I didn't want to own. I didn't even want to rent. So I just started staying in Airbnbs. And yeah, I didn't have to deal with any kind of maintenance. I didn't have to deal with anything really. I had like plates, towels, furniture, TVs, cable TV. I didn't have to deal with any of all the stuff that people have to deal with when they start renting. So I loved staying in Airbnbs. I did it for about 3 years, or almost about 3 years. Whenever I stay in an Airbnb, I think this is such a great idea for people who own a home. Whenever they travel, you can make money while you're not using your place. Your home might be worth more than you think. Find out how much at airbnb.com/host.
When you find a deal on your favorite thing in the McDonald's app and order it, does that technically count as online shopping? Save money with the app. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
At participating McDonald's, prices may vary.
And it's kind of funny that we really have no scientific theory of consciousness itself. Like we know, okay, if we stimulate different parts of the brain, that gives rise to these thoughts. And if we shut down these parts of the brain, then, you can't remember anything, or you remember something too well. But we don't really know what it means actually when we say something's alive. and conscious. Science has never been able to approach that topic. But then you have guys like you mentioned in your book, Yogananda, but there's even more like recent guys like, I don't know, like Eckhart Tolle, for instance, who wrote The Power of No. Like there's people who seem to induce in themselves this feeling of universal consciousness. And what do you what did you think before of these guys? What do you think now of these guys? Like what's your thoughts on this?
Well,
What happened?
Yeah, I mean, they're all taking shots at the great mystery and trying to understand it. And there's two different things. There's stories and there's explanations. And religion, stories allow us to make sense of the world, right? So when one of my very best friends, Tim Hetherington, and my colleague and my brother, the guy I made Restrepo with, I was in combat with him for a long time. When he was killed in Libya, in combat, the day before, I had a bike accident in New York where I'd almost died. I wasn't hurt at all, but I'd come within inches of a car tire that would have crushed my skull, right? I mean, it was extremely close, right? And, but I didn't die. And it felt like I was supposed to, but I somehow narrowly avoided it. And then the next day, Tim was killed. And I developed a story, right? I don't literally think the world works this way, but I developed a story that I dodged death and death had to take someone, so it took Tim. And I was crushed with guilt and shame that it was supposed to be me, but it was Tim. Now, I didn't literally think that, right? But it felt like the world worked that way. And it was part of my processing some very painful things in my life, including his loss. And so, one of the things that goes on with people who come up with these really profound visions of a grand unity, I mean, of course, when people do certain kinds of drugs, they feel a sort of many of them feel a universal connectedness. The sort of standard shamanic journey is the shaman goes into the afterworld, right? Into the land of the dead, into the universe, into the expansion of all things, and then back across the border to his little tribe that needs the information that he or she got out there. Like there are all these traditions in human society of exactly that. Like you leave the particulars of our puny little biological lives ourselves, and you step over the threshold into this sort of vast expansion where everyone is all things. And those stories are very powerful. There may be at the quantum level an actual explanation, like an actual intellectual theory framework for those stories, right? They may not just be stories; they may be stories with a real explanation behind them. And I will say, just along those lines, after I finished the book, I read a fascinating story about Dostoevsky, who as a young man was a sort of political radical in the 1840s. And before he was a famous writer, and he and his buddies were kind of radical. They would sit around and talk about outrageous things like liberating the serfs, for example, right? And in Tsar's Russia, that kind of talk wasn't appreciated. And the lot of them were rounded up by the police and thrown in jail for 8 months. It wasn't a particularly serious crime, but 8 months in prison, right? So eventually they were released, they were piled into a wagon. They just assumed they were going to be returned, delivered to the court and discharged, returned to their families. Great, 8 months, Instead, the wagon turned into a city square, and the men were told to get out, and they were tied to posts. And there was a firing squad lined up in front of them. So these young men had to go from the joy of being released from prison to, oh my God, my life's going to end in a few minutes. They imagined the hallucinatory experience of suddenly standing facing these rifle barrels, waiting for the command to fire. And it was a setup. So the truth was that it was a mock execution. And at the last moment, as they braced themselves for the command, right, to have their chests torn open by rifle balls, a rider galloped into the square and said, the Tsar forgives them, right? But in those moments, because of Dostoevsky, we get to know what those moments are like for a person, right? And they're exactly this. He looked and he saw sunlight glinting off the church steeple. And he thought, wow, in moments, I'm going to become part of the sunlight. I'm going to become part of all things. right? And if I should survive this somehow, I'm going to turn every remaining moment of my life into an infinity. That is exactly the kind of hallucination that people have on ayahuasca, that dying people have. Like, it's just interesting. My book is divided into two parts, what and if. What is what happened to me? If is a thought experiment. What if there were something more? How would it conceivably work, right? And where I land, like Schrödinger, so I feel like I'm in good company, is some idea around that sort of the mysteries of the quantum world and what is consciousness and does it pervade everything? And is that the explanation for all this just frankly weird shit that keeps happening in all of our lives?
It's funny, in the very beginning of this podcast, you said you're a committed, not just an atheist, you're a committed atheist. Like, you really wanted to emphasize that this is almost your religion, is atheism. And for your almost, not quite explanation, but the closest thing you're coming to it, you're taking the most extreme scientific theory and applying it to this. When, like you also said, there could just be many things we just simply don't understand. And religion is maybe this storytelling from thousands of years ago, and quantum mechanics, maybe this obscure scientific theory, but maybe there's something in the middle that is able to explain universal consciousness somehow. And it's probably not religion, but maybe it's related to quantum mechanics. And what does it mean, committed atheism? Do you still feel as committed as an atheist as you were?
Well, there's two separate issues. Yes, I'm an atheist. I mean, belief in God.
What does that mean? Like, so you don't believe in, the Bible or Vishnu or whatever, but what does religion really mean? Do you believe in some things that we don't understand, like some higher consciousness that's in the universe?
Well, you could believe in God and not be religious, not have a practice of religion, right? Or you could go to church every Sunday and practice religion and not actually think that there's a God. Like, I went to church once, and it was in a very poor part of Baltimore, and it was a Black revivalist church, and the experience was totally transcendent, right? The singing, the fraternity, the community going on in that place, the power of the pastor who was speaking. I mean, his sort of vision, totally transcendent. Affected me enormously, and none of it had anything to do with God. I mean, he threw the word God in there once in a while, but it was completely unnecessary for a profound human experience in that building, right? And so, for me, I'm an atheist because God is not part of my daily practice. It's not part of how I understand existence and my life, right? It's not part of how I understand the universe to work. And, you could have a creator God. I mean, believers often say, well, listen, the universe is vast, it's complex, nothing like that could happen without a creator, a watchmaker, as it were, who designed it, right? Which that argument actually has some flaws, but just take it as a given. Like, all right, say there's a creator God that created the universe. It's at current tally, 93 billion light years wide, right? So across, 14 billion years old, but it was, okay, that was created by God. All right, if you want to call it that, we'll go with that. You could have that kind of God who decided, look, this universe is going to have biological beings that walk and talk and can think about themselves. We're going to have turtles. We're going to have kangaroos. We're going to have worms. We're going to have humans. What aren't we going to have? Like, we're going to have all. And when those things die, they're biological beings. They decay. They go back to the earth, and they no longer exist in any form, right? That God could have decided that there was no afterlife. Right, quote, afterlife. You could also have a universe that was started by a massive quantum fluctuation, as some physicists propose, that requires no God, right? Started completely by physical means initially at the quantum level. But in this universe, in this completely materialistic, rule-driven universe, there is at the quantum level some kind of post-death existence that we do not understand that involves something called consciousness, which, like gravity, is sort of everywhere and nowhere at the same time, and is crucial to the physical existence of the universe. Without it, the universe wouldn't exist. Like, you can imagine that. You don't need a God for that to happen. So you could have a God and no afterlife. You could have an afterlife and no God. You could have neither, or you could have both. So I'm an atheist because I've never seen any evidence of God. it's an open question for me if there's a post-death existence, because I did actually see my father. I remember seeing my dead father above me in the trauma bay. Had I seen God above me, like, trust me, had I seen God above me at that moment, I would have thought probably a hallucination, but maybe not. Like, maybe I've been wrong my whole life and there is a God, but that's not what I saw, right? I saw my dad.
And now going forward, like, how has like Dostoevsky said, his daily practice would change. His view of his relationship with himself and the universe has changed from that moment. What do you think you've changed from that moment?
Yeah, I changed enormously. I mean, initially the change was incredibly negative, right? I mean, I was incredibly neurotic and fearful and paranoid and anxious, which is very.
What were you fearful about? What were you anxious about?
I was afraid I could die at any moment. And, I knew that had I been on an airplane flight or in a traffic jam or camping with my family in the woods when the aneurysm ruptured, it ruptured at a completely random moment, right? Then I would have died, absolutely, right? And, that afternoon I was going to go running, and, I run on these game trails in a kind of trackless, like, piece of woods that, like, nobody goes back there. Had I gone running instead of spending a couple hours with my wife, because we managed to get a little babysitting time, I would have died crawling around in the woods. So my paranoia took the form of I couldn't be alone. I had to always be near a phone where I could call the ambulance. It was unbelievably neurotic, like Woody Allen levels of, like, medical neurosis. And then eventually it settled into a more troubling phase where, and again, this is very common for people that almost died, I started to worry that maybe I had died, and that the return from the hospital and everything that followed was actually a dying hallucination, and that I'm a spirit, and that my children, my family can't see me. They don't know I'm here. And I know it sounds like a just weird, sort of silly thought experiment, but I can't tell you how real it felt and how palpable the fear was that I was misunderstanding everything. After I saw my father, I started to doubt everything. Like, how do I know? I was blown up by an IED in Afghanistan in 2008. Like, maybe I died then, and the whole rest of it has been a dream. Like, I started to doubt everything, and that was the beginning of a kind of descent into madness that, like, took quite a while to recover from.
How did you recover?
I eventually got a therapist, and I did research about NDEs and some of the so I realized I'm in good company. Like, a lot of people turn extremely neurotic and have all the same fears that I have. So, like, that reassured me that if it, of course I could have been imagining all that, of course. I mean, you can never, at one point I went to my wife and I was like, just tell me I'm really here. Like, I survived, I'm here, just tell me, right? And she said, yes, you're really here. And in my mind, I'm like, that's exactly what a hallucination would say. Like, damn it, right?
Yeah, there's no way to convince you.
There is no way. But what happened, I had a panic disorder. I basically had an anxiety disorder. They're very common. And I did some pretty good work with this shrink, and the passage of time helped. And finally I was able to turn to the book as an intellectual endeavor. And when I write, I have to abstract things to write about them, right? Like, and in the process of abstracting this experience, I basically was able to sort of, like, preserve it in amber, right? It'd been sort of embalmed, and it no longer had the emotional resonance that it did immediately afterwards. But I got to say, it was completely eclipsed the trauma of combat, right? I mean, the trauma of this, like, completely eclipsed anything I experienced in combat. It was completely debilitating. And I finally understood when people say that they're bipolar, or that that they have PTSD, or that, I finally understood the how debilitating mental illness can be. I did not get it until I experienced, and how debilitating depression can be, because I eventually got extremely depressed to the point where I was actually worried about myself. And that was when I went to talk to a shrink.
And so now, after that and after writing the book, how do you feel this experience has changed your life going forward?
I mean, I know it's a sort of trite bit of wisdom, but I absolutely am more appreciative of life, and not just life as experienced, But the fact that anything exists at all, and I do mean that like in the largest possible sense, like that there's a universe that's 93 billion light years across, that I'm in it, that I have children, that I'm capable of love, right? That I'm like all of that, that when my daughter is upset and sort of losing control of her emotions, that I can pick her up and comfort her, and she clutches me like a little animal, right? And I'm like, that I can do that and it works, and I've calmed her down, this little creature that I love, like that I can do, all of it is suddenly like, frankly, not to sound sort of a little bit religious, but it's kind of a miracle. And that, that it's taken me, into my 50s. I was 58 when this happened to me. It took having children very late in life and then almost losing everything to realize, like, wow, just be thankful. And
Do you think losing so yes, you had, your daughter was 3 years old when this happened, or 2 years old when this happened, and you were, and so you're kind of in between. You were in between this darkness, this dark void with your father, and the surgeons that were about to work on you. Do you think if you didn't have anything, I mean, this is a big what if, there's really no answer, but if you didn't have your daughter, your wife, these things that kind of compelled you back, would it have been tempting to follow your father into the darkness?
I don't know, and it's a good question. So what I would say, I didn't know I was dying, but on some level, my body, I think, kind of knew, right? Whatever, knew in quotes, right? Like, I was in a lot of pain, and had I not met my wife and had a family, some other version of my life, I think it would have been filled with sadness and regret that those things didn't happen. And I think I would have been a very unhappy 58-year-old in a huge amount of pain. And I think that person, and with no one to sort of live for, right? And I think that person would have shed this sort of earthly existence more easily. As it was, I'm living for these people, from my two daughters and my wife. I'm living for them. Like, that's why I'm alive. And so in a very, very conscious and deliberate sense, every day, right? That's my daily practice. It's not God. It's like, I'm here for them. That's what I am right now. And it's a profound way to live, right? That I don't think I was nearly mature enough to do 30 years ago. Thank God I didn't have kids then. But finally I crossed the finish line. Like, men mature late, but eventually they get there, right? And so I think it's very possible without that, the sad, unfulfilled life I would have been possibly living would have been much easier to leave, and I might have done.
Well, I mean, your book has such a really engaging exploration of this whole event and what it means, and what you've learned and studied. And again, like you said, it's divided into two books. There's the story of what happened, and there's kind of where you go from here, where you go from, you had this experience. What does it mean to you? What does it mean to life? What does it mean to everybody? And you particularly in the beginning, you intersperse the stories of what happened to yourself with these experiences of death that you'd encountered up close in war zones, and as your career as a journalist, which you've written many excellent books on. I actually have, unrelated to the topic completely, I have a writing question for you. Sure. Based on how you wrote this. And you're always a great writer. I always learn from your writing. There's very few books where I feel like, oh, this is not just an interesting story. Like, my own ability as a writer is changing because I'm reading this person, and you're one of those writers. So that's why I want to use this opportunity to ask this question. So you basically, the prologue begins. It's titled "We've Been Expecting You," and it starts off. I had an Almeric Tri-Fin and a brand new 5mm winter suit, and I squatted on the beach, waxing my board and watching heavy January surf pound the outer bar. So you're about to tell an experience of kind of coming close to death in surfing. And this begins a kind of set of experiences, whether it's, other kind of experiences that maybe were too close to death for your taste. And then the next chapter is called What? And you start off, the pain in my abdomen arrived without fanfare one September morning when my eldest girl was 2.5 and the household was, and on and on. And you start to tell about your actual direct experience. I'm curious why that wasn't And I'm not questioning it one way or the other. I'm curious about your thought process. Why was that the second chapter? And I know it's technically the first, the other one's a prologue, but why did you write that as put that as the second chapter? That seems like a great first chapter. Well, I don't know.
Yeah, understand that there's the chapters, they're really actually sections. So the book has 2 chapters in it and the prologue. So just so people are clear, it's not a lot of chapters, just 2. It's like what and if. So the prologue, I did that because, first of all, movies do this all the time. They'll have like a little sideshow drama that sets the tone, sets the mood, right? Like the couple's having dinner and they get into an argument, hard cut to, whatever, he's in his job and he's, whatever. I mean, it's just a little, so it sets the tone, like, just so that this is the kind of territory we're going to be exploring. So it was the first time that I'd almost died. And it allowed me to do all the biographical backstory that I felt like the reader would need to know about me, since they're going to be like inside my abdomen for the next 100 pages. Like, you might want to know whose abdomen it is, right? So I was like, all right, the surfing story where I almost drowned in January off the coast of Cape Cod, that will be a vehicle for slipping in just sort of minimal biographical details that you'll need to know, so that when I say the pain announced itself suddenly one Saturday morning, blah, 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 whatever it is, that you'll know the thumbnail sketch of the life history of the person that's happening to. And otherwise I'm having to do that work during the headlong rush of the medical drama. Like, I wanted the medical drama to be as propulsive as possible. And if I have to sort of stop and fill in some backstory about how I went to Bosnia at night, whatever, like, that just slows it down. So it was a way to keep the actual story going full tilt once it started.
I see. And I guess also it's a way to foreshadow that death is going to be a topic. Yeah. So that when you say the pain in my abdomen arrived without fanfare, we could start to guess, this pain's going to lead to potential death.
Exactly. I mean, the last sentence of the prologue is, this dream I had of the crew of the Andrea Gale, which is a boat that sank that I wrote about, and I researched these men, although I didn't know them. And I had a dream where I worried that the dead men were angry at me for invading their privacy, and I encountered them on the beach. And instead of getting mad at me, they waved me over. And it was as if they were saying, it's okay, you can come, we've been expecting you. And that's the last thing you read before the pain announced itself. Like, of course the dead are expecting us, right? They're dead. They know how this works. Like, you'll get here eventually. We've been expecting you. And so that was just a sort of ominous little I was teeing up the story with this sort of ominous passage.
Yeah, because you have the what and the if in that prologue. You have the what, which is the potential surfing disaster. But then you have the if. What if there is a potential afterlife where there's sort of a rules to it or a story to it or whatever, and that's what we're going to explore for the next 100 pages. All right, well, thank you. I did have that question when I was reading this. Thank you so much. So, in my time of dying, how I came face to face with the idea of an afterlife, Sebastian, you say it Junger? How do you say it?
Junger, Junger, but it's Junger.
Well, thanks so much. I really wanted you on my podcast years ago when Tribe came out, such a wonderful book, and now I'm so glad you came on the podcast now. I really appreciate it, and a great book. I was riveted. I read it in one sitting, and then went over it again, in preparation for this. But beautiful book, and such intriguing and interesting topics we all have to face. So thank you again for coming on.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. I really enjoyed the conversation.
When you find a deal on your favorite thing in the McDonald's app and order it, does that technically count as online shopping? Save money with the app. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
At participating McDonald's, prices may vary.
Earning your degree online doesn't mean you have to go about it alone. At Capella University, we're here to support you when you're ready. From enrollment counselors who get to know you and your goals, to academic coaches who can help you form a plan to stay on track. We care about your success and are dedicated to helping you pursue your goals. Going back to school is a big step, but having support at every step of your academic journey can make a big difference. Imagine your future differently at capella.edu.